Okay, well, I think it's time we started, and let me begin by recognise that we're meeting on the lands of the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people, and acknowledging their elders, past, present and emerging. And also I'd like to welcome all of you here. I'm coming out in such inclement weather, and I'm glad to see such a great turnout. Tonight we have speaking Professor Nann, who is the well, I got to know him when he was head of school at the University of Newcastle, the head of School of Mathematical and Physical Sciences, as it then was. But he's since left to begin his startup company, Allegro Energy. And, well, I should say a little bit about before he came to Newcastle. I don't know a lot about that, but he was head of a research group in New Zealand for a while before coming to Newcastle to take up the head of school position, and before that he was a researcher in Adelaide in Australia at least, before after coming here from Germany. So welcome, Thomas, and please tell us about Allegro Energy.
Yeah, thank you, George. Also, thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to see so many familiar faces, so an introduction would not have been necessary. I think I know most of you already. And thanks for coming. So what I suggested to George that I talk about is, I don't need to point that here, I need to point it to my computer. All right, we need to do that differently. All right, so while we do that, I thought I'd talk a little bit about everything around my journey from university to becoming an entrepreneur. And I'm sure you all know these really helpful self-help books, like How to Become a Billionaire in 4 Easy Chapters. And that's pretty much how I organized this presentation. So how to become an entrepreneur as an academic in a few easy steps. So there are 7 steps, and I cover pretty much everything. So in the beginning, there's a little bit of science, but not too much, and I'll try to explain to those who don't know electrochemistry what that all is. But then there's also a lot of stuff about my personal journey and what I experienced, and in the end I also talk a little bit about business and what we are doing there. So I hope it's a little bit of everything. So the first chapter of the self-help book is you need to find a problem to solve. Now that's pretty easy because problems are everywhere, and one of the problems that I realized relatively early in my academic journey was that we need really big and a lot of batteries. So as many Germans, I always felt very passionate about climate change and doing something about it. And like 25 years ago, when I started my own research, I did all sorts of stuff, artificial leaves and water splitting and this and that and the other. But when I came to Australia in 2010, in South Australia, I realized generating renewable energy is not really a problem. There is an abundance of it available, and we can do that very cheaply and very efficiently. It's just a matter of time until renewable energy generation is cheaper than burning fossil fuels, and we all know that meanwhile that has happened. It is indeed much cheaper, but there is a little problem with most renewable energy vectors. Most of them are intermittent, so as we all know, the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow. So what do we do so that the lights don't go out at night? And the only way to fix this is to put a lot of storage into the electricity grid. And here is an example. So what you can see on this graph, this is from a website called OpenNEM. So you can open that, and then NEM stands for National Electricity. What is market? And you can then look how much energy is being generated and used across Australia. And that was a very windy and sunny day in South Australia, where the arrow points. So yellow is solar energy and green is wind energy. And you can see on that day, it was last year, 29th September, in case you're interested. in South Australia generated much more energy than they needed, and if we shifted that to here, they would have very easily gotten through the night with renewable energy, but they didn't, because purple are imports from Victoria, and that's basically brown coal energy. So that just demonstrates very clearly why we need that. So, and I forgot to show one thing here. There are also batteries in this graph. So if you look here, blue is batteries, and here discharge, blue is batteries. And those of you who have very good eyes, you might see here a tiny little bit of blue up here. And so that just highlights, in South Australia, we've got lots of batteries actually on the grid already, but it's not putting even a tiny dent in this universe. So it's more or less useless. It's not making any difference. And that's why I also want to show this one in California. So California was in 21 roughly where we are now. They also had some batteries here in orange, the batteries, and in 21 it made almost no difference. But then they put lots of lithium batteries in the grid. Now lithium batteries are for short duration storage. They store energy for 2 to 4 hours or so. And that now makes a difference. So you see here the more orange in the right one, but it still doesn't get California through the night. And the reason for that is because the night is longer than 2 to 4 hours. So we really need much more storage to make an impact and to make a difference. So, but that is not the only problem. So there are other problems as we transition to renewables. So I was talking now about this left here, the balancing supply and demand piece, pretty much. But as we build a renewable grid, the way the energy is being distributed is actually different. So at the moment it's pretty much a hub and spoke model. So we've got big power stations like the Eraring power station or Liddell, and then cables run from all of these power stations in all directions to all of the users and houses. So there is a central generator where a lot of energy is generated, and then it's being distributed in all directions. Now renewables work generally a little bit different. So we know many of you probably have got solar cells on your roofs. So it is very distributed. Wind, if you have a wind farm or a solar farm, they're usually not that centralized like these power stations. And that means that the transmission of energy through the cables all around the country works a bit differently. And the grid, the electricity grid, has actually not been built for that. And there are two ways how that can be mitigated. So either we build a new grid, which would be insanely expensive, of course, or we put lots of batteries again in the grid to mitigate this distribution imbalance. And then the last point here is system stability. Also, who knows where the 50 or 60 hertz come from? That our AC voltage? Exactly, Florian. It is basically the inertia of the generators. So they spin with that frequency, and this is where the AC frequency is coming from. And if we replace everything now with solar cells and renewable energy, we lose this inertia. Please come in. And the problem there is if there's a big user in the grid like the Tomago or however you pronounce it, aluminium smelter, and they switch on their smelter ring, then they start to shift that frequency, and that's really bad, and all the physicists here in the room can explain you why. And again, that can be mitigated with batteries to just bump that back into the right frequency. So these are all reasons why we need lots and lots and lots of batteries in the grid. So we have a problem. So we have identified a real world problem, And for me, that was, as I said, roughly 2010-ish when I came to Australia, that I started to realize that. And at the time, I was still doing all sorts of stuff. I realized, okay, I have to focus my research a little bit more, because it might be good for papers if I do 5 million different things, but it's not really making a difference. So chapter number 2 in the self-help book is solve the problem. And I wrote here, don't work with the goal of publishing papers. This is one of the things that I started. I got a little bit tired of that at some point. So George mentioned I moved then from South Australia to New Zealand to lead the McDermott Institute there. Where was I? Okay, the whole publishing thing. So I have actually reached a point in my academic career where I really didn't care so much about the number of papers that I'm publishing. And also I started to question myself, is that really making an impact? And as you, or the academics here, and I know that kind of 3/4 of you are academics, know that you can game the system quite easily. You just salami slice your insights in as little slices as you can, and then publish it, and so on and so on. But I was really kind of frustrated with this whole game, and thought, okay, I want to work something that really solves something. So I need to explain to you what a flow battery is, because that is what Allegro does. And you need to understand that, because otherwise you don't really understand what I'm talking about in the following. So most of you, if you think about a battery, probably think about an AA or AAA battery or pouch cells or something like that. And in these batteries are typically 3 or 4 components. So there's an anode, a cathode, an electrolyte, and sometimes a separator in this battery. It's all packaged together in these little cylinders, and that is a device. Now, a flow battery is not a device, it's a chemical process. So in a flow battery, you find all of these elements, but they are not packaged together in a device. They are separate and run like a plant. So in a flow battery, and that is just a block diagram, you've got a thing in the center called a stack. And in this stack are the anode and the cathode and the separator. These things, but the electrolyte, where the energy is actually stored, is being external to these stacks. Now, when you charge a battery, the speed with which you can charge the battery is pretty much proportional to the area of the electrodes in that battery. And the amount of energy that you can store is pretty much proportional to the amount of electrolyte that is available to the battery. Now, by separating these things, so the speed is called the power, and the capacity is called the energy. And by separating this physically, we separate pretty much these two features of a battery, so the power and the energy. And what that means is that these things scale extremely well. So if we need a really, really big battery that stores energy for 12 or 24 or even 100 hours, all we need to do is build a bigger tank and fill more liquid in. Now, those of you who have heard of fuel cells, this is pretty much a rechargeable fuel cell. It's not a fuel cell because it's rechargeable and we don't burn anything, but it works the same way. Good. So any questions about flow batteries? Did everyone understand it? Okay. So the most important thing in a flow battery is the electrolyte, which is that liquid that goes into these tanks. Now, let's start with a very basic question. What makes a redox flow electrolyte good? What are the features? Now, there are actually 2 components of the electrolyte. One is the actual electrolyte, which is the liquid in which everything is dissolved. So, for example, water can be an electrolyte, or what else? Turpentine. Who knows more? Okay, I'll stop here. So the electrolyte itself and then in the electrolyte is some chemical compound, here are some molecules, that actually store the energy. So where then electrons hop on and off, and where the energy is stored. So the electrolyte itself needs to have what we call a wide electrochemical window. What that means is we have to be able to apply a lot of voltage without breaking it down. Because obviously if we can only charge the battery with 0.1 volts, that's a pretty useless battery. So we want a lot of voltage. We need ionic conductivity because we are dealing with electrical things. So if it's a completely insulating electrolyte that doesn't conduct electricity, it's also useless electrolyte. It has to be safe, so we don't want it to explode and burn. And we want it to be cheap, so if it's super expensive, it's not good. And now we're moving to the active materials that are actually storing the energy. What we want there, we want them to be stable, so we don't want them to change every time or degrade rapidly as we charge and discharge the battery. They need to be soluble, of course, in the electrolyte, otherwise they're not usable. And then there's stuff like thermodynamics and kinetics and things which we don't need to talk about now. So there's a lot we have to actually look at to find a good electrolyte. So that goes now back actually to my time in South Australia. So when I realized that we need a lot of storage, long duration storage, I also realized, okay, it has to be somehow sustainable, it has to scale. There's absolutely no point to build the world's best iridium, platinum, gold battery that will earn me perhaps a Nature paper, but it's the most useless thing on the planet because no one will be able to pay for that battery. So, and we really did that with my team. We took a periodic table of elements like this and started to cross out elements. So we didn't want to work with anything radioactive. We didn't want to use super expensive stuff or super duper toxic things. And when you do all of this, so we ended up with these blue elements here, which is 11 or so, a small handful. And then we very broadly looked into how can we store energy only using these elements. And then, ta-da! We found something new. So, who knows what an emulsion is? Who thinks that, yeah, at least one or two. So all of you, I'm pretty sure all of you came in contact with emulsions today. So an emulsion is a mixture of an oil and water. So milk, for example, is an emulsion. In most paints are emulsions. They are in pharmaceuticals, in beauty products, they're everywhere. So an emulsion is nothing new. It is a very well-known thing. So what you see here on the left is olive oil and vinegar. So my lovely wife has taken this picture on our balcony. And if you give that a shake, you form an emulsion. That is actually this. And if you let it then sit for a while, it starts to separate again into the oil and the water. Now there's a special subgroup of emulsions, it's called microemulsions, and microemulsions never do that. So microemulsions, we call that, are thermodynamically stable. So actually their state that they want to be in is in the mixture. So they can let them sit for 1,000 years on the windowsill. They will never separate into the oil and the water. Now, I had this idea that I thought, well, a microemulsion could be actually a good electrolyte because that was my rationale. We have a lot of water and a little bit of oil, and in the oil we could dissolve all these wonderful organic molecules that are normally not water soluble and use them. We get access to thousands and thousands of molecules to store energy that cannot be used in water. And in an emulsion we've got everything present that could work. So that was my idea. So it did work, I can tell you that, but there were some other advantages, and I'm coming to that. So So I didn't modify. This is one of the slides that I usually show investors and customers. So these are the features of these microemulsions. They're super cheap, not flammable, and so on and so on. But we talk a bit more about science. This is not so interesting for you. So at the time, I was at the University of Wellington in New Zealand, and I had this idea with the microemulsions, and I did ask one of my PhD students, who is now my co-founder, Rowan, and some of you know him because he finished his PhD in Newcastle. So I asked Rowan, look, try using a microemulsion as an electrolyte. And he did that, and he came back with things like this. So what that is, it's called a cyclic voltammogram, and what you do in cyclic voltammograms, you change the voltage in your cell, in your electrochemical cell, and you record the current that's flowing through the cell. It's a little bit like a hysteresis. You start somewhere here and you increase the voltage, you go back, and then you go back here again. So what that method shows you, I think there was something written here, no. What that method shows you is pretty much if if there's a chemical reaction happening in that electrolyte. So when the current goes up, like here at 2 volts, that means that we have an oxidation process in our electrolyte, and the other way, if the current goes down, we've got a reduction process. So Rowan came with these measurements to me, and I thought by myself, these PhD students, I have to do everything myself, because it couldn't be. So normally if you apply a voltage to something aqueous, so where there's water in the system, you cannot go over, let's say, 1.5 volts or so. So because at that voltage the water then starts to electrolyze. So many of you have probably done that in high school. So you put 2 electrodes in water, apply a voltage, and you get hydrogen, and split the water and hydrogen and oxygen. But that didn't happen here. So I was thinking Rowan did something wrong, because it cannot be. So I sent him back to the lab, and long story short, after 3 days or so, I just went myself to the lab, and it was actually true. So we didn't split any water with these microemulsions, which was a bit weird, because more than 80% of them were water. So what's going on here? But then we also started to, my original idea was to put stuff into this microemulsion that you could normally not use in a microemulsion. So, and we started to try that as well. So on the left here, this is how these cyclic voltammograms look like if something's happening, so if it's not just a line. So on the left here, there is a salt, an iron-based salt, that is very well soluble in water. So we chucked that in, and all that little duck shows is, well, it's working. So we can oxidize and reduce it. But then we put also stuff in like this here. This is a so-called Buckminster fullerene, and this is one of the worst things that you can find in chemistry. It's absolutely soluble in nothing, so it's in toluene a little bit, but it has brilliant electrochemistry, so you can put electrons on that. You can actually put 8 electrons on it, but this thing is nasty. This really, to experiment with that is really bad. And we put it in, and to our surprise, that also worked. So actually this other thing also worked. So we had 2 advantages. So we didn't split the water, and we had suddenly access to a plethora of molecules. So what's going on here? And I stop with the science soon, don't worry too much about it, but it's just so that you understand where this is all coming from. So in the microemulsion, we've got oil and water. So here on the left, the oil is yellow, as oil is, and the water is blue. And what we found out is that if you have an electrode that is hydrophobic, and many electrodes that are used in batteries are hydrophobic, so they're usually graphite or carbon-based stuff, then the oil forms a very, very thin layer on top of this electrodes and like protects them. It's like a skin. So this is super thin. It's about a nanometer thick, this film. And I promise you that's the last nerdy thing that I say, but in electrochemistry there's something called an outer sphere and an inner sphere electron transfer. And what that means is the stuff has to go, in one case it has to go very close to the electrode to do its thing. In the other case it can do it from a little bit from a distance. Now water is one of the very, 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 very few exemptions that has this inner sphere electron transfer, and the beauty is here that the water is too far away from the electrode to actually react. That's why we don't split it. And anything in the oil or in the water, because there's usually outer sphere electron transfers, can do it. So this is really elegant, to put it mildly. So that is a very beautiful feature of this microemulsion. This is why we are not seeing water splitting, but we can still charge and discharge pretty much anything we put in it. Now, so here on the right, it's actually not just one layer. They build little layers and substructures on the surface, which you can measure at the Australian synchrotron if you wish. Okay, so now I'm getting a little bit more commercial. So why is that so interesting commercially? And this is one example out of hundreds that I could show. So what you see here at the top, this molecule is called ferrocene. And ferrocene is not soluble in water, but ferrocene is capable of storing 1 electron. So it would be a good molecule for storing energy. But it's not soluble in water. So what are the options that you can do with it? So on the left, you see the option you modify it. You make it water soluble, and there are actually companies out there that do that. They use exactly this molecule. So they modify it and make it water soluble. That works. It's not a bad thing. The problem with that is that you first have to make the molecule. So that is usually expensive. No one has got that molecule. It takes for ages. You have to build a chemical factory before you build a battery. But it's an option. In the middle is the second option, which is you use an organic electrolyte. So that thing here is called acetonitrile. And you can use that as an electrolyte. Now that also works quite beautifully. The problem with that is acetonitrile is insanely expensive and also flammable. So no one would use that in a flow battery. And on the right, you see the same thing in microemulsions. So we just put it in as it is, and it works, and the microemulsion is super, super cheap. This, by the way, this delta E here for the experts, that is a measure. The smaller that number is, the quicker you can get the electrons on the molecule and off. And that is actually even better than the organic electrolyte. So really nice. So we did that with many, many molecules, so hundreds and hundreds of molecules, and identified many that work really well and many that don't. But the beauty with these microemulsions is that we have the choice. So we can access theoretically an infinite number of molecules to store the energy, which opens all the doors. All right, so I stop with the sciencey bit now. So you learned enough about electrochemistry now. If you want to learn more, you can go to the guys at the uni who do that for a living. So the benefits that come commercially out of this are pretty much on this slide. So from the left to the right. So we've got nothing rare or scarce in it because we have the choice. We can choose not to use so-called critical minerals. So when I'm occasionally I'm on conferences for the mining industry, they sometimes invite me and they talk a lot about critical battery minerals, and they're always very disappointed if I tell them we don't need any of those because we just use molecules that are abundantly available. It is really cheap. It's a cheap way of storing energy. It's safe, so the electrolyte is not flammable, and there's nothing like thermal runaway or what you get with lithium batteries. It is very scalable, which has to do with the underlying platform, this flow battery. Because it's a process and not a device, we can service and maintain it quite easily. So lithium batteries degrade over time, and typically at the 7 to 10 year mark you need to replace the battery. But because these flow batteries are a chemical process, with service and maintenance we can keep up the performance over a very, very long lifetime. And then all the ESG stuff, we tick all of these boxes. All right, that was a very long chapter, but I thought at the Royal Society I can talk a little bit about that, and our investors and customers never hear that, so you should appreciate the privilege. So, chapter number 3. Accept that you won't be able to solve every problem before starting commercializing. So that's a very short chapter, but that's something I learned in New Zealand, because one of the KPIs in my job there was to help spin out companies out of the McDermott Institute. And while I was there, we spun out 7 companies. I was only involved in one of them. But what I realized is, as scientists, as academics, there's always more we want to know, we want to do. It's never finished. And if you have something wonderful and you want to commercialize it, at some point you just have to do it, even if you are not finished with the research. And just accept that, okay, we need to do it, because if we wait until we know everything and did all the measurements and published all the papers, someone else has done it. And I just show you one quick example of that. So when we started Allegro, this is how the performance of our batteries looked like. So over 2,000 cycles, the capacity degraded from about 100% to 40%. This is absolutely terrible. So you wouldn't be able to sell a battery like this. It's really bad. And we didn't have a solution for it at the time. So we kind of vaguely realized it has to do with oxygen, which was true. So if we keep the oxygen out of the system, that's a flat line. But it took us quite a while to fix that. But nevertheless, we started the company. And I think this was a really important lesson that I learned. So if you are interested in entrepreneurship and you've got something that you really think that can change the world, just do it at some point and stop being perfect. So that was a very super short chapter. So next one, this is very delicate. So freedom to operate. TTO stands for Tech Transfer Office. So that's kind of the name that entrepreneurs use to for these university venture arms. So most universities give that some fancy name. I forgot what it's called in Newcastle. Key now, okay, yeah, something like that. So but every university has a TTO, and this is usually the first place to go. And I hope I'm not treading on too many toes, but this is actually the first big hurdle everyone who wants to spin out a company out of a university has to take. So what you see here is a spin-out company out of the University of Auckland. I know that company very well. I know all the people that run the company. And this is how their shares, so the equity of the startup, is distributed. So the University of Auckland owns 25%. Then there is some venture arm that is connected to that university that put a little bit of money, not much, in the company, that also owns 25%. The 35 is the professor who supervised the students that started the company. This professor is not involved himself in the company, other than an advisory role. And these two are the ones that actually start the company. And I can tell you, no one in their sane mind would invest in that company. It's a dead birth. Because an investor will rip that to pieces and say, look, the founders have no skin in the game, and after 1 or 2 investment rounds, they can just walk away. So, and also what investors, I tell you 2 things that I heard over and over again about universities from investor. The first one is dead weight. And the second thing they always say is execution is more important than ideation. And now I understand that. I didn't when I was at university, but the blood, sweat and tears that go into a company is the execution bit, not the ideation bit. So what investors absolutely hate is something like this, that the universities take big stakes. But I need to stop somehow here and show you a little bit. Then I just ramble on a little bit more about this. So this is my academic journey. So I started studying in Stuttgart, my hometown, where I was born. And then I went to the University of Freiburg, which is not that far away from Stuttgart. I did my PhD in habilitation there and had my first, not tenured, but the equivalent of an associate professor position there. Then I moved to the University of East Anglia in the UK. Then the financial crisis hit and they closed all the schools of chemistry. Then I came to Australia, South Australia, then Wellington, and then finally Newcastle. So I went to the trouble and looked when was the first paper that I published about microemulsions. That was actually at the University of Freiburg in 2005. And before I published that paper, I did 3 years or so research on that topic and somehow on microemulsions. And so what I'd like to highlight with this here, academia is a very international business. And the ones of you that I know all of you, none of you has actually grown up. Flora? No, George, you're the only one that I know that has always been at this. No, you've been in Wollongong. See, this is actually, I would dare say, none of the academics in the room stayed at one university all the time. And the academic journey is a journey where you accumulate knowledge and experience over a period of time. And in Europe, there's generally the understanding that academics own their IP, so the universities generally don't claim that. And what I really don't find actually outright unfair, why does the University of Wellington own our whole IP that I developed over 20 years at 5 different universities just because we happened to patent it at this point. And actually this university contributed basically nothing to it because at the time I was employed as the director of the McDermott Institute, so my job was actually not to do any research or something but to run this institute. So I think they have no claim, but they own all the IP. So I stop with the winch now, but I think you get the idea. And I think there is just something fundamentally wrong here. And some of you have already seen that from my time at the University of Newcastle, because this is out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that surprisingly defines the role of education quite well. And it's not to make money and to start businesses. So the role of education is quite different. And in my opinion, and that's just my personal opinion, it's not right that the universities and TTOs make it so hard for entrepreneurs to start businesses. And you know, I heard so many times people saying, why does that not happen in Australia, that research is being commercialized? In Europe and in the US, everywhere it happens quite much easier, but not here. And I think the reason is because the TTOs are pretty much preventing that. So they're not helping, they're in the way. So I have to stop now, otherwise I get, someone will sue me. All right, so next chapter. Now we made it out of the university. So the next chapter, we need someone to fund the new business. So that's also a very short chapter. I wasn't sure about the audience, but how many people are actually interested in doing that. But one thing I can really say is these are all the things that helped us, that supported us with the first baby steps. So Energy Lab, they're now connected to UTS, but at the time they were independent. That is an accelerator that helps startup companies in the energy space, not just university spin-outs. CSIRO has the so-called ON program, and I think Florian, you've been in that as well. And all the others, they're similar stuff. And that is really a good starting point. Except for CSIRO, all of these are independent institutions that help researchers to learn the right skills and to learn how to raise funding, which is pretty much the first thing you have to do when you start a company. So, almost finished now. So we are coming to the first valley of death. And I said shifting your mindset. So what I mean by that is, what I realized at some point is that the incentives at universities and in business are very, very different. So, and that is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. But you, as an academic starting a business, you need to be aware of that and start to kind of flip over. So at universities, the journey is being rewarded. So you accumulate knowledge, you learn something, you publish it, you spread it, you learn more things. So the outcome is not that important really, because the outcome to some degree is the journey. So that you learn all the time and accumulate knowledge. In business, it's only the outcome, nothing else. If you have something that works and you don't know why, that's good enough. And that is a totally different mindset, which I personally found really, really difficult to switch to. And now also in hindsight, what I found when I was still working at uni, I found that very often. So that academics had some beautiful research work, and then they try to find a problem for it that solves. But it's not working like that in industry. And this it's a different approach and a different mindset. And I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's just different. So in business, it's all about money. And if you cannot show your investors or customers how your product or what you're doing is saving them money or making them money, they're not interested. It's really as brutal as that. And this is the slide that I normally use with investors and customers to demonstrate that. So typically when you talk about batteries, what everyone wants to know is what is the cost per kilowatt hour. So they want to have $1 per kilowatt hour cost. And that works for lithium-ion batteries, because in lithium-ion batteries, the kilowatt hours are kind of scale linearly with the number of batteries you have. So what you see here, the y-axis is the cost of the power, the kilowatts, and the x-axis is the capacity of the battery here in duration, how long it holds. So the kilowatt hours is actually the area under that line. And so this is a typical line for lithium. It starts at 0 with no batteries, and if you build a big battery, you add more and more and more of these cells, and they just increase in price. Now, for a flow battery, that looks a bit different, because in this process we have a separation between power and duration. So we have an upfront cost of the plant that we built in this chemical processing, and then the cost scales with the cost of the electrolyte we add to that. And so initially that's more expensive than lithium, but at about 8 hours at the moment it starts to undercut lithium. So here's just some examples of other chemistries that are used in flow batteries, and you see immediately where the problem is. If the cost of the electrolyte is too high, it will never undercut lithium, and then the business case doesn't work out. So it's really as simple as that. So that's what we're doing. That's what I'm telling all of our investors. We're pushing that line down. Okay, but there's another thing that more and more customers start to understand. I mentioned that already at the beginning. So lithium-ion batteries degrade over time and you need to replace them, whereas with flow batteries you have a much longer lifetime. That is called, if you factor that in, that's called the levelized cost of storage. And if you do that, actually flow batteries become quite cheap. So, almost done. So the last chapter is actually having a product to sell, and I'll show you our product now that we are selling. What I wrote here, death by 1,000 pilots, that's just a little reminder. Many startups die that way because there is a temptation that you never go over this pilot stage and that you give your product to more and more people, and then in the end you never have a customer. You always have someone who's trying your stuff. So that is a big danger that I've seen quite a lot. So that's where we are not there yet, but that's where we want to go. This would be a 30 megawatt 12-hour battery with our system, so 360 megawatt hours. So that's a substantial battery. But in order to get there, we need to, and a lot of engineering is going. So I did talk a lot about science so far, and there is sometimes a little bit of an arrogance of scientists over engineers. I've noticed that. But it's incredible the amount of engineering that goes into something like that. Because you have to think about many different things at the same time. So not only that it works, it has to be manufactured, so it has to be designed for manufacturing, it has to be designed for scaling, and you have to think about supply chains. So can I actually get the stuff that goes in the battery and all of this stuff? This is much more complicated than I thought. And that's pretty much what we did until now. So our first pilot is a battery at the Eraring power station just down the road here, 20 minutes for Origin. So I have to also, disclaimer, Origin also invested in us, so they own 5% of Allegro. And this is how the battery looks. So on the next slide is a photo. So it's, you see, it's not a device. It is a bit of a plant. So all these boxes here are the so-called stacks where the electrolyte is pumped through. Here are pumps, here are tanks, and then in this box here, in that box is all the electronics. So we designed an extremely modular thing. I like to compare it with Lego because it's really a bit like Lego. You can, well, one Lego brick weighs 100 kilos, but with a forklift you can pretty much plug it in and out and play with it. So and this is what it looks like. So on the top left is a stack. So these are 40 electrochemical cells, and on the bottom left is what was on the last slide in a picture. So the battery is pretty much completed now. We haven't delivered it to Eraring yet, but that will hopefully happen in the next 2 months or so. I think that was it. Let me have a look. Oh no, one last slide. So where are we going from here? So if you remember, my starting point was pretty much we need a lot of that. So we need gigawatts and gigawatt hours of these batteries. And there is really no point in messing around with little 100 kilowatt batteries. So we need to get to this gigawatt scale as rapidly as we can, and this is pretty much our business plan in one slide. So the plan is that we scale 10x for 5 years, and then we are at gigawatts. So at the moment we are on track, but that is ambitious. So, and that's what we're doing. I think that was it, yeah. So thanks very much. These are the 3 founders, myself, some of you know Rowan. Fraser actually finished his PhD in Wellington and was never employed here at the uni, so he started Allegro straight away. That's it, thank you. Any questions? can go and win the $100 now. Yes.
Thomas, you up.
Oh, okay.
Converting ideas to products, what you've described is the same in any industry.
Yeah.
But you've got to get people who believe in the thing and back it, and then you've got to sort out enough problems to show that it's got some sort of viability. And once you do that, then you've got to, nurture it like a plant, but it's the same process not only at university, but anywhere.
Yes. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for the talk. So starting a business is risky, right? No matter how promising the research looks and the funding and so on. And on the other hand, you had this ongoing role at a university, which many people would find very appealing. So was there a defining moment for you in which you said, I'm going to give all of this research stuff up and go out and do batteries?
I'm thinking if I should give you the honest answer or package it a
honest
bit
answer,
more,
please. Yes.
or package it a bit more diplomatically. So I give you the honest answer. So you're absolutely right. It's a very high risk, and also especially in the beginning, a company, before we raised any money, there was just no money. It was just how to do this. And so what we did was that Fraser was the first one who worked full-time at Allegro, and we raised a little bit of money, like in a couple of $100,000 range, just to pay Fraser. So there was not enough money to pay me at all. And so I stayed at the university just to have a job and to have an income until we raised enough funding so that I could leave. But if I'm being brutally honest, there was at the time there was a lot of talk from Key and at the university about enabling academics to start businesses. And they were talking about stuff like 2 years of unpaid leave, so that if it doesn't work, you can come back to the university to your relatively safe job. And I wanted to do that. That was my first attempt. And I went to the people at the university and said, well, I take up your offer, I want to do this. And the university made my life hell. So they wanted in return equity in Allegro, although this university had nothing contributed to it. And it went on for 2 months or so, and then I just had enough and quit. And I have to say, no regrets at all. I'm actually kind of happy now that I cut the ties with the university, because they are not interfering or meddling or anything. So that was my story. But to answer your question, that was the defining moment when I was so annoyed with what they were trying to do that I just didn't want to do that anymore. And, well, many of you know there were other things at the university that were happening just before that time that I also not really wanted to do anymore.
I'll first, Florian, sorry. You're talking about the pros of your products. You haven't talked about the cons. So, for example,
there are none.
There are none. Okay. So, for example, like portability. Like I can't carry your products anywhere. So you talk about scales up. Like, is there an opportunity to scale down so that I can take it with me when I'm travel or like other applications?
No, that is indeed something you cannot, or that's not good for flow batteries. So we get many inquiries of people that want a battery like that for their home, but it doesn't add up if you scale down. So there is kind of this minimum size where it makes sense, and that has to do with all the auxiliary stuff you need for it. You've seen all these pumps and electronics and boxes and stuff, and that all costs money. And if you scale that down, you still need all this stuff. And that doesn't make economic sense anymore. This kind of 100 kilowatts is the very bottom of what makes sense. And as you said rightly, also these are not mobile, so they're stationary batteries. We built that, and it would be easier to build another one than to move it.
So you've managed to get the university off your back. Congratulations on that. But now how do you deal with your investors? To what extent do they meddle? Because one reads a lot about startups where the investors then cause all sorts of trouble and maybe push out some of the founders and that sort of thing. Have you experienced anything like that?
Yeah, so it's really important to pick your investors well, and that is something that we learned I showed you the on-prime and energy lab and all this stuff, so that you learn at these accelerator programs. And you're absolutely right, there are some investors that you really don't want in your company. Typically, they're called financial investors. So they just want to make money as quickly as they can. And if they invest in a company, they just try to, it's called exit, as quickly as possible. So push up the value and sell it. And this is something we clearly didn't want to do. So Origin is a fantastic investor for us because they want the product. They actually don't care about the increasing their investment much. They want the product, and that's good for us because they're super supportive. Then our biggest investor is the American Grantham Foundation for the Environment, or whatever they're called. That is also a great investor because they are mission driven. So they want to make money, but it's not their primary goal. They want to help the environment. And so this type of investor is really good. And another investor that I should mention is the MELT here in Newcastle. So the MELT is an hardware accelerator. So they are investing in hardware startups. But they are not just putting money in, they are very hands-on helping to the business to grow. So for example, the guy that designed here our batteries or this sort of stuff, he's actually a MELT person, and he has an office in our premises, and he's with us pretty much all the time. And the MELT provided that capability. So this type of investor is great, and yeah, you're right. It's important to pick them well, and yeah.
Talking about.
Oh, can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry, the emulsion electrolyte that you were talking about. It sounded like it might not be the stuff that you'd really want to end up in groundwater and so on. So around the batteries, I imagine you'd have a concrete bund or something that if you had a gross leakage, that it would be captured.
Yeah, so you don't want that electrolyte ending up in the groundwater. It is also the molecule that we're using is toxic. And that's a highly regulated area, so bunding is required by law. So we have to bund everything and make sure that nothing gets out of that. But having that said, there are no volatiles in the electrolyte, and nothing burns. So if there is a spill, and it's almost unavoidable that there is a spill, it's a matter of cleaning it up with the right procedures. But yes, it needs to be bunded.
One other question, if I can get to, for the price of one. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the aim would be to go to a gigawatt installation. How big would that be? Like, how much land would that require?
Well, that
have a feel.
That really depends, because unlike with lithium batteries, you can also go vertical with these batteries, and you can arrange them in different ways. So the way we handle this is that we design pretty much the site or the plant for each customer individually. And we are talking at the moment, I can say it's not a secret. So we are building our next battery for CSIRO here in Newcastle at the Energy Center, and they are very space constrained. So they have only a tiny little patch of land where the battery can go, and we just kind of arranged it so that it fits into that. So I can't give you a clear number, but that's obviously extremely generous. So and could be half that size.
Would you see this flow battery coexisting with other technologies like pumped hydro
Well, personally, I think there's no one solution for everything. So in my opinion, probably in 20 years' time, we will have a mix of different storage. So pumped hydro is very good for seasonal storage. So with flow batteries, that would be a challenge to go more than a few days. And I think we will have a mix of different technologies.
Thomas, I guess one of the big parts that you've got to do now is look at various applications where your battery adds value more than other types of things. So that means, I guess, you've got to do a hell of a lot of research into industries and places where they can use your battery and where it's going to be the best choice.
Well, we've already done this.
But there must be heaps of other applications that you've still got to look at.
So generally, we found that the business case ads are best for C&I customers that either already have renewable assets like solar cells or are at the fringes or off-grid, because they really need long duration storage. I can give you a quick example. So for example, we are talking with one company, they have a big solar array and no storage. And what they realized after 5 years of operation or so is that they pretty much dump the energy that they're producing around lunchtime into the grid or get switched off soon, and then they buy it back in the evening. So they are actually losing money with their solar. And with a battery like this, they could just build a little microgrid and become independent. So there are already really good business cases.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I just have a rather quick question about this micro-emulsion system, since this is basically the bedrock and the foundation of how this system works. From what I can gather previously, like micro-emulsion systems are really prone to unwanted condensation or even clogging to the system. So how you fix that problem?
Did you say clogging?
Clogging, yeah.
No, so of course we need to find the right microemulsion. So it is a bit of a finding a needle in a haystack problem, because so for those who are not familiar with this area, so you pretty much trial and error until you find a microemulsion that doesn't separate. So you're right, for a battery that's not enough. We also have to make sure that the microemulsion is stable over a very high temperature range. So the one that we're using now is stable between 5 and 70 degrees Celsius. And also, as you said, no solids should ever appear on the system. And then there's actually another prerequisite that we didn't anticipate. So we use toll blending services. So people that blend for a toll to make the electrolytes. So we are not doing that ourselves, the mixing. And these toll blenders, they usually, if you buy, let's say, something at Bunnings, fertilizer or so, they're usually mixed by these toll blenders, and their tolerances are relatively high. So if you have a microemulsion that is only stable within 1% of the components or so, they won't be able to blend it. So we also have to optimize it with a relatively high tolerance. And yeah, that's a lot of work, and that's actually the kind of the core IP that we have to find these microemulsions with which you can do that.
Hello, Thomas. Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wanting to ask about what I think is a fairly aggressive 10 times growth of your plans. Have you found that 10 times is about right? Or because I'd imagine each step of 10, would reveal all sorts of problems you'd never seen in the previous one.
Yeah. So actually, I can tell you how we are going to do this. So the first thing is, this is a so-called one design. So I didn't know what that is until recently, but it is designed in a way so that if we build a bigger battery, we just do more of the same. And the way of scaling 10 times is by using local business and contractors. Pretty much all of the components. So if you look at the thing at the bottom left, 90% of that is being manufactured in the Hunter Valley. So these steel frames can be made here. All this plastic is coming from AIP Plastic at Sandgate. The stacks in Port Stevens, injection molded. So we farm out basically. And when we talk with suppliers, we qualify them immediately and ask them, can you scale to this scale and what would it cost and da. So if a supplier cannot scale that quickly with us, we are looking for a different supplier. So that's pretty much the trick how we keep that very, very fast pace. So minimum changes in the design. So it's already designed for scale and using as many people or doing as little ourselves as we can.
Yeah, so it's like you build one wheelbarrow and then you build 100.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Thomas, could you use those batteries in ships?
I had this question before, several times actually, and the problem with that is that the energy density is not enough of the electrolyte. If you do the math, you would fill half of the ship with electrolyte, and that's not working.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm interested to know, you've answered the question about the issue of when to jump from the university. Excuse me, and your circumstances in which you did that. You've also indicated that it's important not to wait until you've got things perfect to make the jump. Can you tell me what aspect of your research, or at what point in your research, you recognised that there was an opportunity to now commercialise something?
So when we discovered this microemulsion electrolyte, I would say within a few months we realised this is a gold mine that we struck. Because and it's still like that when we still do a lot of research in the company. It amazes us every time how well it actually works. So we realized that really early, but then the journey until we actually commercialized. So first we need to do a lot more fundamental research on it to really understand the system better. And actually, the flow battery was not the first product I didn't mention that we looked at. These electrolytes work also extremely well in something called a supercapacitor. So the Newcastle tram runs on supercapacitors, and we thought, okay, this is the easiest product because it's just a drop-in solution. We swap one electrolyte for the other, and we've got a supercapacitor that's really, really good. And in the first year, we focused completely on supercapacitors. But then what happened was that we realized there is no industry in Australia that actually needs supercapacitors. So the ones in the tram here are imported from Spain. So we just didn't get any traction in Australia, and then Origin and Suncable actually asked us about flow batteries. So flow batteries, there's a huge market here, and people want them, and supercapacitors, while they're really a nice product, it's just the wrong place in Australia to do that, and then we swapped and pivoted to that. So what I'm trying to say with that is it's not a straight line. So it's a very windy, actually, line, and led to all sorts of mistakes and things we thought we know and didn't.
Okay, well, thank you, Thomas. Do we want more questions, or do we?
One more is okay. So one.
I've got a terribly naive question, right back at the basic stage of how your emulsion interfaces with presumably the electrode, and it reminds me very much of using liposomes in a biological fluid to deliver drugs. And I wondered, is the liposome, you encapsulate the drug in a fatty thing, which just shows how ignorant I am. And I wondered if you'd looked at the same principles, or you apply the same principles here as you do for drug delivery.
It's pretty much the same thing. It is really extremely similar. We also got, with drug delivery, you use usually phospholipids or things like that, which is a surfactant. So we use a different type of surfactant, or a mixture actually of surfactants, but it's exactly the same principle. Another interesting aspect is if we put only surfactants in, it's not working. We need a little bit of the oil just to kind of coat or close the electrode off. But it's exactly the same principle.
Thank you. Well, I suppose you've got that with a cell membrane, which has got the oil in the membrane when you've got a cell. So it's the same.
No, in a cell membrane there is no oil, so it's just a phospholipid bilayer.
Yeah.
But we need a bit of oil grease in it to cover it. Yeah.
Right. One last question.
Thanks for the talk. About the energy density of the flow battery. So
25 watt-hours per liter.
Cool. So it depends on the size of the volumetric or the mass of the electrolyte.
It depends on the solubility of the active species. So we are not touching anything that's under 1 molar. Because otherwise we just need too much liquid. And also it depends on if you've got a 1 or a 2 electron redox reaction. So if you've got a molecule that does 2 electrons, you double the energy density. Oh, yeah. So there are different factors, but the main factor is really the solubility. And by the way, we're not using ferrocene because it's not soluble enough. It works beautifully, but it's just not that soluble.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Let's thank Thomas.